Hello and welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of Team English Talks. And I'm Miss Owens, and with me today I have got Mrs Dodd.
Hello.
Mr Steele.
Hello.
Mr Buff.
Hiya.
And Miss Weston has come back for a second episode. That's how successful we were last week.
Hello.
So you're very, very welcome. So today, again, it was Miss Weston's choice. We've just let her run with this. We are going to be talking about the women of an Inspector Calls. Okay, so
Just can't help myself.
Yeah, Mr. Steele, why talk about the women of an Inspector Calls?
Well, yeah, defer to the man to talk about the women, much
Ooh.
like Priestley. Yeah, it's. I was talking about this earlier in this idea of how they're not very nuanced characters. I don't believe,
No.
and I think that's because we have to. It's the best way to realise this idea of characters as constructs, because Priestley was a man writing. He was born in 1894. He had certain views about women, and his female characters are reflective of that. I think it's important that we discuss how these characters are presented and why they come across in a certain way as a result of Priestley's intentions. I think it's a really important subject.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's quite easy to get sort of wrapped up in this notion that because Priestley was a socialist, because he was a red-blooded northerner, and because he's the pride of Bradford, that he couldn't possibly put a foot wrong. But I suppose when you look at Inspector Calls through a modern lens, you have to consider the fact that actually there are some quite sort of deeply embedded patriarchal overtones within the play. And whilst we might not necessarily bang on about it in an exam answer, it's definitely worth bearing in mind to make sure we've got a more nuanced response to an exam question.
Definitely. I think there's certain events that happen within the play to certain female characters that are kind of... We find ourselves, when we talk about Priest's intentions, almost having to brush them under the carpet because, it was a different time and blah, blah, blah. And it becomes a little bit... Well, I mean, we'll jump straight into it. If we talk about Eva Smith's treatment at the hands of Eric Berlin, because we're supposed to ultimately side with Eric at the end, we almost have to diminish what he did to Eva Smith.
He's
How she was treated.
problematic.
Yeah.
It's very, very problematic because we just have to think about it in terms of, well, that's not what Priestley would have intended, and back then, actually, marital rape was acceptable. So, the fact that he threatened to make a row and then she slept with him because she said yes, then that was perfectly acceptable.
Yeah.
And Priestley wouldn't have seen an issue with that.
What he did was incredibly dark, and in a modern novel, obviously he'd be vilified by readers. Well, in a modern play rather, he'd be vilified by sort of the audience for that. But again, sort of the way it's glossed over in the play, we can see that
Just because he says he was sorry, and he accepts what he did, what he'd done was wrong.
It's like, never mind, don't do it again.
But I have to say, I do think that we're kind of coming at this like in modern times, this would be treated terribly. And I'm actually not sure it would, given the circumstances of, Eva's lifestyle and some of her previous choices. I actually don't know if a modern audience, if this was a modern play, would be as sympathetic. We'd hope so, but I actually think that that's what's interesting is a lot of the ideas that are in the play about women are things that exist still now, and that we'd like to think we've moved on since 1946, but in a lot of ways we haven't, which is another reason why I think examining these characters and their motivations and how they're presented is an interesting way of looking at the play anew.
Yeah, well, look at the way in which the Yorkshire Rippers victims have been seen as well. At the time, look at the newspaper articles suggesting that because they were prostitutes, their lives didn't matter as much, and their idea of their consent or their value as a woman, as a person.
We've seen it throughout history, haven't we? It's a tale as old as time. Sort of any woman with any kind of sort of forthrightness or independence or opinion is always kind of hauled over the coals for it. I mean, look at Paul and Mary Magdalene from the Bible. Her name is synonymous with prostitution, isn't it? And yet at no point in the Bible does it mention she's a prostitute or even allude to the idea that she's a prostitute. But again, it's this idea that any woman with sort of self-autonomy automatically bears a certain degree of responsibility for what happens to her, even if she's an absolute victim in a circumstance.
Yeah, I was going to say, because we're coming at it from that angle, aren't we? Because we can't help talking about the male treatment of women. You know, we start off thinking about the women of In Spectacles, and yet it comes back to how the men treat them. And that objectification of women that we've talked about before, haven't we, with Gerald? Who we love to hate,
yeah.
with the the hard-eyed, day-faced women that he is quite happy to criticise, and yet will take no responsibility for playing part in their downfall in society. So before we sort of look at Eva Smith, are there would you say any of the other female characters or victims in?
Well, I think they're all victims of their own circumstances in a way. I mean, you've got Sheila, who's kind of this sheltered, naive, upper middle class woman, and I think there's quite a good quote which I was trying to find, so I'm just going to something Mr. Burling says about women's clothing being important, and you've got to let them have their little things, and it's this idea that yes, okay, she is a frustrating, ignorant character at the beginning.
Fat line there, isn't it?
Oh, there we go, yeah. That clothes mean something quite different to a woman, not just something to wear, not only something to make them look prettier, but, well, a sort of sign or token of their self-respect. So it's that idea that women are allowed to talk about clothes and looks. They're not allowed to talk about politics, society, art, literature, any of those things. Are allowed to talk about clothes. Yeah. And yet women are looked down on for talking only about clothes. So it's this double bind, isn't it? They're not allowed to talk about politics or big ideas, but if you talk about the things you're allowed to talk about, you're shallow and you know, you don't have any deep thoughts. And it's that, I think Sheila kind of shows this idea of how women were trapped into these roles and then looked down on for fitting into the roles that they were allowed to have. So I think, while not as obvious a victim, of course, as Eva, we do see constraints that society puts on women.
Yeah, and it's probably not a stretch to say that with time, Sheila would eventually grow up to be like her mother. You know, in fact, the incident at Millwoods was testament to that, wasn't it? And you know, I think it's implied that just like her mother, Sheila is a product of her environment.
And just following on from that, we kind of all do this with Mrs. Burling. We are all very much anti-Burling, Mrs. Burling, and rightly so as well, for her treatment of... Get onto that later. For her treatment of Eva. But the reality is that she was very much a product of her time and her class as well. And I always kind of have a degree of sympathy towards her in some respects, because she's spanning across two different eras for a start. But if we assume that she's born around about the mid to late Victorian era, and she's going into the early Edwardian era, what we're seeing is that she's trying to find her place not only in a society that's changed massively over those 50 years, 30, even if you only say she's in her 40s, but 50 years, but also her class, because she has definitely moved down in class.
She was her husband's social superior.
So if we assume that they're an upper middle class family, we can assume that she's moved down her class. That then poses the question, why? What's happened to her? And I just have a degree of sympathy there, that we judge her based on her class, but actually she's just a product of her class, the same as everybody else is, same as Eva is.
Yeah, and as much as well a product of like the constraints put on by society. Who knows what she could have been, or what, you know, any woman could have been at that time if they were given the chance, but she is only allowed to exert her power and influence in this very small kind of section of society.
She wields what little power she has, as the inspector says.
And then what happens there is you've got this woman who can only wield a small amount of power, and she's only able to really do that within the home, in a sense. She would never be allowed to do that out in public, where she's admonishing Mr. Burling. That would never wash with anybody outside the home. That wouldn't stand. And then with the Brumley Women's Society, that's where her power is the place where she can yield it. Sheila similarly with Millward. So,
but then
doesn't mean it's right to do so, does it?
On the contrary, when we think about the Brumley Women's Society and the we think about her treatment of Eva Smith, there's something gratuitous, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't there? It's almost like she does almost revel in playing with Eva to a certain degree, like a cat with a toy. And there is definitely, it's undeniable, you know, that there's that element there, and so I think we have to address that.
But that's also Priestley's own opinions about
Absolutely.
charity coming out, because obviously as a socialist he would not believe in charity. Charities should not exist in a socialist society. It should be
there's no need for a charity.
Yeah, there's no need for it.
Yeah.
And that perhaps showing that the needs of the poor should not be decided on by frustrated upper class women who have who are wielding their power, the little power they do. And obviously Mrs. Birling has more power than Eva Smith.
Yeah.
And
I suppose it's quite ironic in a way, isn't it? Because Mrs. Birling's rich, Sheila's rich, and yet Eva Smith you could say is more free than the two of those.
Yeah. In a sense, she is. Yeah. She certainly has more ability to voice her opinions. There's no way somebody like Mrs.
Well, I suppose she can't get any worse off than she already is.
But Mrs. Birling, it would never have washed for her to be doing, behaving and going on strike and all the rest of it.
But that's sort of the way that Eva is. The fact that she is more free, she doesn't have male control. She's not married. She doesn't have parents. And yet her freedom has to be curtailed by Mr. Birling by not paying her enough to actually live a free life. And that's part of why women in Edwardian times were paid so little, because if they were paid enough to live by themselves, then they would be allowed to be independent, and that couldn't happen.
Yeah, and when you step outside the boundaries of that as well, look what happens to Eva Smith when she starts to assert herself or tries to assert herself and tries to stand up for herself as well, and which, obviously you've got the suffragette movement. There was prior to that,
big strikes across most of the north of England in the late 1800s. In Leeds, female tailoresses went on strike for quite a long time because they were made to pay for their electricity that they used to make garments, and that was taken off their wages. It was taken off their wages. So, again, Priestley's right in a time where he probably would have been aware of that or heard of that, maybe slightly before his time, but certainly as a socialist he'd be aware of it. And the strikes all failed because, at the end of the day they needed money, and the factory owners didn't give in. But that kind of shows you the type of treatment that these women had and how they were used in so many ways. Yeah,
it comes back to them being disposable as well, which comes back to that idea of Gerald and Eric. Gerald, we had an interesting discussion about this. So Miss Weston today, we were talking to Miss Weston, I know she's here, hello, and she was saying about Gerald keeping the apartment, that it's actually his apartment, that Charlie Brunswick doesn't exist, and he kicks Eva Smith out because he's done with her or Daisy Renton in order to then install a new mistress. And this absolutely blew my mind because much as I hate Gerald, I actually believed that he did have a friend called Charlie Brunswick.
I've never considered that Charlie Brunswick didn't exist until...
And yet Charlie Brunswick, obviously Brunswick is a province of Canada. And he goes to Canada. I'd noticed a connection before, but I never thought... It's almost like saying, I've got a friend who's got a caravan, his name's John Caravan, do you know what I mean? I've never really thought about the sort of speciousness of that claim.
But even if Charlie Brunswick did exist, then that's still the idea of these, men sharing it. Like, why?
Lets his apartment out.
For Gerald to do whatever he needs to do in there. Why would Gerald need an apartment? He's got his own place, or he lives with his parents.
Yeah. And ergo, why does Charlie Brunswick need a suites of apartments?
Yeah, exactly.
It's, plural. It's this this kind of behaviour, isn't it? This we're sharing and we're kind of all in it together, and then we all we just keep it to ourselves, and it's really subverted.
Yeah, you wonder if Eric was in that scene when he'd talked about it, whether Eric would be guffawing at that, because he probably he'd obviously know.
Yeah, he knows why. He knows why Gerald never came near her.
As if Gerald couldn't get any worse for me. He lied.
Oh no,
he lied.
Not Gerald. Not Gerald lying.
Yeah, we've got it here. The nice little set of rooms, Charlie Brunswick. So yeah, and now it's completely opened up a new hate for Gerald.
And obviously there's this kind of there's this understanding amongst the women of Ms. Burling's class that there's the sort of understanding that men will do this, and that's just what men do. Men are dogs. Men have mistresses, and you know, as a woman of your status, it's your job, Sheila, just to accept that.
Yeah.
You know, when Sheila says you never came near me last summer, you were busy at the works all the time, and you know, Mrs. Burling, I can't remember the exact quote now.
Something like, you must understand that men with important business to do often spend a lot of time at their work.
Yeah, but here it is. Yeah, when you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll just have to get used to that, just as I had. You know, there's almost an element of denial there, isn't there? Like, she's buried it so far deep in her psyche, but even she almost believes what she's saying.
Yeah.
I mean, he's definitely spending a lot of his energy in business somewhere, isn't he?
Yeah.
That's one way of putting it. Yeah.
But no, it was just another element, and this is why, you know, we teach it year on year out, and there's always something new, either from students or
you always get asked that question. Do you not get bored of teaching this?
Absolutely, I don't. That's a good point, actually. Just after Mrs. Burling says that, Eric guffaws. Again, Eric understands what's being alluded to here, doesn't he?
And the very fact that Mr. Burling doesn't actually, he doesn't actually even make any comment whatsoever.
Yeah, think about the way that it says, yes, of course, clears his throat. Almost, it's like, okay, this is awkward.
Let's move on from this subject, because this is a subject I know very well, and I know what's being implied here.
But that's the thing, isn't it? Like, when they ask you, do you not get bored of teaching this year on year? It's like, no, because new things become apparent year on year on year. There'll be, not that I'm denying that this podcast is incredibly popular, but there might be there might be some there might be some of my year 11s from 3 or 4 years ago listening to this. I highly doubt that are then like, well, hang on, you never taught us this, so you never taught us that. Well, no, because I didn't sort of think about it like that before. New things come to light every single year, and that's why.
Well, my favourite thing is when a student spots it.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
That's what you want. You want the.
Absolutely.
Yes, it could.
I'm going to give you the credit for that this year, and next year I'm going to make sure it's entirely my idea.
I've taken that.
Yeah.
So students out there, if you're listening, which I'm sure you are, and you hear me repeating something you might have told me, thanks.
Right, speaking of things that students like to bring up, okay, Edna.
Yes.
I was about to bring up Edna.
Let's talk about the Edna in the room.
The Edna
in the room. Only working class woman that speaks on stage. Only working class person that speaks on stage.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Please, sir, an inspector's gold.
With her eyebrows.
with the eyebrows.
Do you think that actress in that version is actually Northern, or do you think that's just the worst Northern accent put on ever?
I mean, she's just not a good actress either way.
I hope she's not listening.
I hope not listening. I'm sure she.
Number
I'm sure
3
she
in the
is.
iTunes.
You know what? Let's email her now and tell her.
It's not a great novel.
You were the worst Edna ever. You had 3 lines and you couldn't even do it.
But back to Edna from the play. What can we say about Edna? Well, it's curious that she's the only working class character on stage, only working class woman on stage, and yet she only does what the Burlings tell her to.
Because
her only thing is to respond, which is interesting when we talked about the fact that it seems like Eva has some freedom, but Edna doesn't display any kind of autonomy.
Can we do this in our In Spectacles when we do the musical, or we do our Emmanuel College version, and we're going to have Edna, okay, and they're going to say, Edna, you need to do this. She's going, I aren't doing that.
I won't dare.
I won't dare do that.
It's not my job to answer the door.
Can we just give her a bit of a
absolutely.
An attitude?
I think the thing about Edna is probably this probably wasn't even intentional, but in the Burling space, she is invisible.
Yeah.
And I think that says all you need to know, doesn't it? You know,
I suppose servants were though.
Yeah. She's invisible. You know, Eva Smith. She's never seen on stage, and yet Eva Smith gets far more airtime than Edna, and you know, Edna's supposed to be invisible. That's the whole point, isn't it?
I think sometimes as well we could also look at that idea of whilst we quite rightly give the inspector the credit of interrupting Burling when he's on his mad rant about capitalism and the Titanic and all that jazz. You know, physically, it's actually Edna that interrupts him.
She does that little cut,
That's a
doesn't
good
she,
point,
in
yeah.
the BBC version.
It's
And
an
this
inspector's called.
This is something that I actually speak to my students about as well when we're looking at some of the minor characters. She actually interrupts Mr. Burling in his trailer for his speeches twice. Once to say the inspector's arrived, and then later on as well when he's I can't remember where the point is actually, but this
Is
is
it when
point.
Gerald comes
when
back
Gerald
and she
comes
announces
back and
Mr.
she
Croft?
announces, So although she doesn't have what seemingly is any power, she still is in a sense cutting him short at some points, and I say to them all the time, why is that? Why is Priestley allowing that to happen?
So
I'm
these-
surprised he
these-
doesn't sack her.
Yeah.
These are exactly the things that you should be writing about when you get that essay question on Edna and how she's presented in her play.
Oh,
Well, you could get Edna in the extract.
You
Yeah.
could,
You
or you
know,
could get a question on women
On
in an
women,
inspector's calls, and you
yeah.
absolutely could write that.
Absolutely.
Edna.
I mean,
And class
there's a
as
line.
well.
There's a line here on page 10. When the doorbell rings, Eric sees somebody at the door, and Burling says, "Edna will answer it. Well, have another glass of port, Gerald, and then we'll join the ladies. That'll stop me giving you good advice." There's this real dismissiveness, isn't there? Like,
Yeah.
Edna will get the door, the ladies are yammering on him there.
Yeah.
I won't be able to give you any good advice once the ladies join us, so listen up. It's almost like, the ladies are closing in, let's... there's a real dismissiveness in that line, isn't there?
I also feel like that really sums up the kind of patriarchal society of Mr. Burling is the patriarch, and he is directing or dismissing the women in his life. And if you think about in a sort of societal sense, that was the way that Edwardian society, late Victorian and Edwardian society functioned. Women were not given a voice. They were supposed to do as they were told, and they were dismissed as kind of inferior.
I mean, that brings us on to gender roles, doesn't it, and gender divide, because that's something in Inspector Calls that we talk about quite a bit, isn't it? It's one of the key themes, the difference between the men and the women in Inspector Calls. So, I mean, who've we not looked at? We've looked at kind of Mrs. Burling.
Yeah. We haven't really looked at Sheila in depth, have we?
Sheila.
To be fair, so obviously she's. Again, we were talking. This makes it sound like all we do in the day leading up to recording the podcast is talk about what we're going to talk about on the podcast. And
It's not in the days leading up to; it's just all the time.
And as we know, we are really cool and we don't do things like that. So, but we were talking about this earlier in the songs, weren't we, when we were saying how Sheila, probably as a result of her being written quite one-dimensionally by Priestley and him not necessarily having the greatest grasp on how to write women, actually, unfortunately, ends up still being quite a heavily disliked character by a lot of our students, despite the fact that she shows a lot of maturity and grows and changes by the end. Is that because she is infantilised so much at the beginning that she's so annoying, apparently, that we can't then see her growth and appreciate her as a character?
Just sort of the attitudes
internalised patriarchy.
That have come on that yet still we think we've made all this progress, and yet you're kind of a young woman who likes clothes is instantly dismissed as shallow and stupid.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here because whilst
devil's advocate.
Men can have opinions too. I was going to say Sheila. For me, the reason that Sheila is one of my least favourite characters in the play is because what she does to Sheila, and again,
Eva.
What she does to Eva is so callous and willfully cruel. Obviously, forgetting what the men have done to her, which, God knows. But what she does is so sort of willfully cruel. Her mother dismisses Eva. Her father dismisses Eva. What she does is willfully and calculated, and it is willfully cruel. And I just think...
Me and Mrs.
Is she the worst, though?
No, and I would actually
I'm not saying she's the worst.
No.
I'm just saying for me at the beginning, her retribution's too late. It comes too late. It's like, I'm glad you're a socialist now, Sheila.
Yeah.
Really glad about that, but a woman's dead.
But
You played a big part in it.
She's quite relatable though, because we've all had it, haven't we, where we've been in a really bad mood and something's happened, and then as teachers we try not to take anything out on the children, on the students, and we do a very, very good job of that 99% of the time. But we've all had that thing where somebody just comes in at the wrong time and you just snap at them, or you don't take that step back and think, hang on a minute, it's me that's been quite unreasonable here, and sometimes you want to pursue it. I mean, everybody does. You're not sort of saying with students or anything, but in life, this person really annoyed me. I want to get at them. And then, you know, you go to bed and the next day you're just like, oh, I'm not really bothered anymore.
Yeah,
and she does regret it straight away. You know, she says that she talked to her father
if she
about
regretted
it.
it, she should have gone back.
I'm just
Yeah, no,
gonna,
she should
I'm
have
just going to
gone
go all
out.
out and stick up for Sheila in a sense here, because we're talking about women who are born into the expectation of society, and she is born into a society where really her only role is to look pretty and act pretty, so that for her is a great big thing. It's a big deal. And she clearly is a very insecure person at this point, because she's assuming that she doesn't look as good as Eva does in that dress, and I don't think that's a class issue. I think that is just a female who feels very insecure in her skin and is being held to is being held to a set of standards that she, you know, that society is expecting of her. And then what you then see is her lashing out at that. And I always say to the students, if we go back over the timeline here, this is also the point where Gerald isn't showing her any attention. If you're tracing this back,
and she's
you know,
she's not stupid.
No,
you know, she probably has some idea as to why he's not coming near her.
Yes,
I don't believe for a second. I think probably when she's saying, when you were spending all that time at the work and you never came near me, I think that's maybe a bit of a coping
I
mechanism.
think came near me.
Came
It's
near
such
me
a
is
loaded
a
phrase,
real
that isn't it?
I do think maybe deep beneath the surface she would have had some sort of suspicion as to what was going on. And
I think when she
there is
finds
that.
out what he's up to, I think she will probably be quite grateful that he never came near her.
Yes, to be fair, all that time in Charlie Brunswick's apartment.
And then
who knows what's flying around.
And then there's that also thing of where she shows her naivety of what Eva's life is actually like. And it's hard to know whether this is an excuse or not when she says, I can't remember the exact lines, she said she was pretty enough, I thought she'd be okay.
Yeah.
So that idea, but because Sheila's success in life is based on her looks, she makes the assumption that a attractive woman like Eva, and we know that she's attractive because lots of people mention it, will be okay in life, because in Sheila's world, that person would be okay.
Your looks are going to get you through.
And you know, she's probably lived quite a sheltered life and doesn't fully understand it. You know, this could be an excuse of her saying, well, I thought she'd be all right, she's pretty enough, or it could be a sign of Sheila putting the kind of society that Sheila lives in, the world that Sheila lives in, onto Eva's world. Because she has no idea of actual, you know, what deprivation is, of what desperation is. She doesn't understand that actually being a pretty working class woman could perhaps be more trouble than it's worth.
And I suppose, to completely contradict myself here, sort of, it's good to be flexible.
Alternative interpretations.
You were only being devil's advocate.
You've got to consider the fact that she only momentarily loses control. And we can all say, oh, well, why didn't she go back and tell them that it was all not a big
But she
deal?
did talk to her father, and her father said, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
You know.
And even so, sort of, even in Millwoods, you know, she's kind of chaperoned by her mother. She is sort
she's
of
enough to wind anybody up. Isn't she?
She's there under the auspices of her mother, and she's not there as a person with agency. She's there as a debutante, you know, a young woman who's not yet sort of been released into high society yet. You know, she doesn't really have that kind of clout in the world, does she? She loses control for a split second, ruins a woman's life, and is told by her father not to worry about it. And why would she know any different?
And one of the things I like with Sheila, I've mentioned it before, is that she's incredibly emotionally intelligent, and it's just something that gets overlooked by all the other characters, isn't it? She's the first to realise that it's Eric that they're talking about. She realises the ridiculousness of the situation, which is why she starts laughing, and they're all like, oh, she's hysterical, bless her, you know, little cotton sock, she needs to go to bed. And it's actually because she's much more emotionally intelligent than the rest of the characters themselves that she picks up on all of this.
I think she's very astute as well, because she's got the measure of the inspector very early on. She knows where this is going very early on. So I think there's definitely this. That's why I'm with you, Mr. Steele, on the idea that she probably was already aware that Gerald was having an affair, but it's that idea you've just got to denial, or you've just got to put up and shut up, because that's
that's
what
what
society
society
and that's what's
expects,
expected.
you know.
And to say sorry as well, it's a big thing to own what she did and say, I was sorry at the time and I'm sorry now and I felt rotten, I feel rotten now. You know, I think that's a big thing to say, particularly in front of Gerald. You know, she's engaged to this man, and then she's been made to face a really horrible thing that she did, you know, that's just been brought out in front of the person that she, you know, she's going to marry. You know, you'd be humiliated, wouldn't you? I think a lot of women would have tried to deny it and just be like, or tried to brave it out and say, well, you know, she deserved it and I don't care. Yeah, but she doesn't. She owns it. She, you know, she apologises. So I guess
she does. You know, she gives the ring back to Gerald.
Yeah,
she goes against her
that's
family's
my favourite bit.
wishes.
Go on, Gerald. You have that ring. Give it to whoever. Either Brooks or whoever it is next time.
Yeah. I mean, should we perhaps expand a little bit on Eva/Daisy as a little bit as this sort of mystery,
reinventing
ethereal
herself.
character that never appears on.
Well,
stage,
I suppose
but
it
we
begs
hear
the
a lot
question, sort of, you know, all the other characters apart from the Inspector are kind of firmly planted in place and time. We know they're real characters, but Eva Smith, really, she could be every working class woman who falls through the cracks. She could, you know, she might be. It might be that she's supposed to be a real person, or it might just be that she's representative of all the working class women that the families like the Burlings have done dirty. And it's hard to say, isn't it? You know, is she an amalgamation of millions of women, like the Inspector says in his final speech, millions and millions of people like Eva Smith? Or is she genuinely one person who had to change her name repeatedly just to stay afloat?
You see, I have a different theory around her changing her name. I find it really interesting that she changed her name once she was at the point where she was meeting Gerald in the Palace bar. And I think that was maybe less of her changing her name to create a new life for herself, but more creating a name to for an alter ego, and that was her Lady of the Night name, essentially.
Disassociating,
and you know, she gives herself. I find it really interesting that you know, originally we're referring to Eva, you know, Eve and the connotations of Eve and Smith, but then we go to Daisy, which is a flower that's extremely brittle, fragile, delicate. Grows in very difficult, you know, kind of soils.
Well,
it can be seen as a weed, but also then we've got this idea of her surname being Renton, as you know, to rent. And you just think to yourself, when that reinvention has happened, actually, it kind of caricatures her as this, you know, cheaper, kind of almost less kind of
salubrious,
person, and then from there on, that's when she starts to fraternise with Gerald and Eric. And,
Daisy Renton is the name she first gives to him in the Palace, isn't it? And so maybe Daisy Renton is sort of.
It seems almost like a stage name. It's almost like without, you know, sounding awful. It does seem like a kind of
does.
stage
It
name.
does absolutely. Yeah, it's a very good point.
And we never really find out the name that she uses with Eric as well. So it could be that she has maybe further.
Am I right in thinking that name is made up in the movie? I'm sure.
Yeah, it
Sarah.
is.
She's called Sarah.
She's Sarah in the film, but it's never mentioned.
I know. I've had so many students write Sarah in essays, and I had to remind them, like, the name Sarah is never used in the play.
No.
Do you know what? That's quite interesting because she's made up all of these names, and yet Eric Burling uses his real name, doesn't he?
Yeah.
She calls herself Mrs. Burling.
Yeah.
So again, that's a power thing. That's
Yeah,
an idea of
why should he have to hide his identity?
Yeah.
If she told people, nobody would care, nobody would believe her, nobody would give any weight to what she was saying.
I mean, the men that are in the Palace Bar are all of the same oik, effectively, aren't they? You know, you've got aldermen in there. And no doubt Mr. Burling at some point will have frequented there, I reckon.
Yeah.
Obscene fat carcass.
Absolutely wedged into a corner.
I also think it's quite important that we only really find we don't find out much about Eva Smith's personality, but the most we find out about her is through Gerald.
Yeah.
So, and he views her in this very one-dimensional way as this kind of grateful, you know, pretty, empty-headed young thing who admires him. We never know. Is that true? Did she admire him? Because I think on surface reading, a lot of students say, you know, oh, well, she was really grateful for him. And you think, well, was she, or is that what he wants to believe about her?
He says, I didn't feel about her the way that she felt about me. But again, you know, it's that, are you just sort of keeping her in a cage and feeding a fish every now and again? And
that's a really good point.
He's imagining himself as this knight in shining armour who saved her, so it fits into his narrative that she's this really grateful, loving, you know, she loves him. But if you look at her circumstances, it looks like she's desperate, and not as some students write, she's not a gold digger.
No.
You know, I hate that phrase because it takes away from the situation she's in, and I think a situation that luckily a lot of us in modern times don't understand, where she's got no job, she's about to become homeless, there's no safety net, she will, and people did, starve to death.
you know, if she doesn't do something about it. So she sees, Gerald as an opportunity to survive. So it's a survival sort of way of doing it. And maybe she did love him, but I always think that the fact that we only find out that through Gerald's story, and he is only going to paint himself in this positive light, perhaps.
Well, and this is a really good point, actually. It's very, very hard to analyse Eva Smith's character in some respects because her story is told from a perspective of others.
Yeah.
The only facts we learn about Eva Smith are outlined by the inspector, and beyond that, her story is told by other people, and so, you know, unreliable narration, isn't it?
And even the inspector's got an agenda.
And they're all the majority of the people who do know anything substantial about her or have spent any kind of time with her are males.
Sheila and Miss Burling only meet her briefly.
Again, it lends credence to this idea that she's a ghost. She's in the ether. That she's, you know, I don't think she's a literal ghost, but I mean she's, for the purposes of a play, we're never really meant to. We're never meant to know her. We're never meant to picture her as this physical person. She's more of an idea.
Which is why it's frustrating whenever you have adaptations of an Inspector Calls, it always shows
and shows a backstory as well
shows
sometimes, and it drives you
which
mad,
is lovely for a Sunday night drama, but for teaching purposes it can make it difficult,
it's
can't
very
it?
difficult.
And then we went to go see it at the Alhambra, and that was also not a good version.
That was wild, wasn't it?
You mean you didn't like it when the Burling's house fell over?
I didn't like it at the end. It was the one I went to. It was the Alhambra that Sheila and Eric was sat on the stage laughing their head off at the end of it.
I seem to remember there was a slap at some point.
So there was Mr. Burling punched Eric, and
that was
the
it.
audience cheered, and it was like, if the audience are cheering Mr. Burling at the end, then you haven't adapted Inspector Calls.
And I just remember sitting in the audience there thinking, how many GCSE students are in this audience thinking, right, Burling punches Eric, note that one down. Does not happen.
Yeah. Some damage control would happen the next Monday.
Oh dear. Right.
Speaking of damage control.
Yeah. Mrs. B.
Hey. I was going to close it.
I was just
have we talked about Mrs. B?
I don't. Well,
we kind of.
Well, to be fair, I feel like we should close with Mr. Brough, like talking about how much he loves Mrs. B because he referenced it.
Talking about Mrs. B.
Yeah.
No, I'm talking about Mrs. B. Sorry, she's just an icon. You know, she's great with customer service. She knows how to get what she wants. She asserts herself. She wears great hats, probably, at least in the film adaptation. She's got that icy glare. She pierces right through you. She doesn't take no for an answer, and I love it. I think she's an icon.
I mean, the thing is, you could say with her, at least she sticks to her guns, doesn't she? She literally just sits there and goes, I'm not sorry, I'm not sorry, I'm not sorry.
Is the reason why we dislike Mrs. Burling so much more than Mr. Burling is that because of our own internalised misogyny?
Yeah, she's
that a woman who stands up for herself, we automatically are like, oh God, she's a bit big
and
for a
stands
bit.
by
It's not my internalised misogyny, it's my internalised classism.
I
just hate the upper classes.
I'm sorry, but Mrs. Burling and Mr. Burling have a great deal in common when it comes to the way they comport themselves, and yet Mrs. Burling just comes across as callous and cold, but Mr. Burling, because he's ruddy-faced, he's had a few drinks and he's waving his glass around, he's got that sort of element of likability to him, but Mr. Burling...
and I'm just going to say again now then, but that's the playwright's choice.
It is the playwright's choice, absolutely.
So I'm just going to ask this question as well, because a few of my students have asked this. Is Priestley a feminist? Do we think, or proto-feminist?
No,
do we
I
think
don't think
he
so.
sticks to
I would
females?
never say that ever.
No. Because I think sometimes there's this misconception around him that because he kind of it appears that he deals with Eva in a sympathetic light, that ultimately means that he supports females and that he's showing how, badly treated she is. But actually, I think there's a real fear that we lose the whole point of this if we kind of go down that rabbit hole of him being this feminist.
He uses the women in his play.
He's utilising
as a tool
them
to get his own political
and they're all
views.
correct, and they're caricatured. But more so the women than the men, if anything, are caricatured.
Oh yeah,
He doesn't use the women to promote any sort of feminism or to get across these ideas of equality with women. It is as a tool to promote his political agenda.
With the male characters, we see depictions of men of that class that we wouldn't typically have seen in that era, sort of seedy sexual misdeeds, alcoholism, theft, ways we wouldn't have typically seen men of that class depicted in that period. And yet, as you say, the women, they're kind of caricatures, you know, the kind of...
Mrs. Burling's upper class, so she has to be cold, she has to be stern, hard-faced woman.
Absolutely. Sheila's a young upper class woman.
So she must be ditzy and naive.
I think it's quite clever as well in the circumstances, because the circumstances in which Mr. Burling, if we're looking at contrast with Mrs. Burling, dismisses Eva Smith, it's purely business, isn't it? It's that sort of, I can't afford to, well, I don't want to afford to pay you, I'm going to dismiss you, she caused trouble, blah blah blah. Whereas you apply the same to Mrs. Burling, you know, she's causing trouble for her, but because she's a charity and because she's seen as, you know, you automatically associate her not with a business but with that charity, with that giving, with that caring, that sense of...
But I also do think that the way that Mr. Burling dismisses her is personal, because he says she had rather too much to say for herself.
Yeah.
And it's that idea that she stood up to him, so she's got to pay.
The rest of the workforce were allowed to go back into the works, and she was the one that was held responsible solely for that. And you're right, because
she's outspoken. So even though Mr. Burling does it for personal reasons, we can... the kind of an audience will frame it as just a business decision, and we kind of because men deal with business, they don't deal with emotions. Where his firing of her was a very emotional thing. He felt that she had disrespected him, and she had to pay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. It's we see it even in TV nowadays with programs like Dragon's Den and The Apprentice and stuff, don't we? This kind of like this sort of business mindedness where, you know, everything's just a core business decision, and that's fine, but
they're for insult as well at the same time, don't they?
Yeah. At least there's one thing we can say about Mrs. Burling, and that is when she rejects Eva in the charity, it's really clear that hers is an emotional response, because she's using the family name, and ergo, because she's using the family name, anyone finds out that there's somebody who's putting themselves around as a Mrs. Burling who's pregnant and her husband's run off and, you know, is the thief and all the rest of it. It's personal for her then, isn't it? Because of that. Whereas with him, he rejects all that.
Just business. Again, it's this veneer of acceptability because he's a man and he runs a business. And that's still true today to a certain degree.
Absolutely.
Okay, right. I think we are ready to bring this to a close.
Yeah, we should probably start.
I'm not. Let's talk more about Mrs. Burling. Let's go!
Was it Mr. Bruff and I have been saying for years that we reckon we could literally write an essay on Edna, but we don't have time here for this. But the staging of Edna.
Even the musical rehearsals have stopped. It's time to go.
I mean, maybe Mr. Bruff can branch out and do his own podcast on Mrs. Burling.
If you get someone to cover my Year 7s on Monday, I'll write you an essay about Edna.
Okay.
That's a no, then.
I don't want an essay about Edna that badly.
No, I don't think. Yeah, it's not that useful. Sorry. Okay then, right, well thank you very much for everybody taking part, and thank you for our one listener.
Maybe it'll get to 2 this week, we'll see.
Maybe 2, well you know.
There was 55 on last week.
Maybe there'll be somebody accidentally
we
listening
could,
in the
how
background.
about we set up a Patreon and we start giving shout outs?
And adverts, I'm willing to wear whatever clothes this is not.
We could get
sound.
sponsored.
Press pause.
Bye everybody.
Oh dear.